In 1903, a young mother sat for a photograph, cradling her infant wrapped in delicate white cloth. For decades, this image remained a cherished family heirloom, a tender moment frozen in time. But when descendants examined the photograph more closely years later, they noticed something disturbing in the fabric's folds. Faint marks that shouldn't have been there. Patterns that told a story the family had buried for generations. If you're enjoying this type of content, don't forget to leave a like. It really helps the channel grow. Margaret Chun stood in her grandmother's attic in Portland, Oregon, sorting through boxes of old photographs on a cold November afternoon in 2019. The air smelled of dust and aged paper, and weak sunlight filtered through the small window, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. She had been tasked with digitizing the family archive, a project she'd been putting off for months. Most of the photographs were predictable, stiff-posed ancestors in Victorian clothing, faded images of long-forgotten relatives at weddings and christenings. But one photograph stopped her cold. It showed a young woman, no more than 25, seated in an ornate wooden chair. In her arms rested an infant, perhaps 3 months old, wrapped in an elaborately embroidered white cloth. The mother's expression was peculiar. Not the soft smile typically found in maternal portraits, but something harder, more distant. Her eyes seemed to look past the camera, past the photographer, into some middle distance that held secrets. Margaret pulled out her phone and took a quick snapshot to send to her mother. Within minutes, her phone buzzed with a call. "Where did you find that?" Her mother's voice was strained, tight with an emotion Margaret couldn't quite identify. "In the attic with all the other family photos. Who is she?" There was a long pause. "That's your great-great-grandmother Ellalinina Whitmore. The photo was taken in Boston in 1903, just before she moved west. She looks so young and sad. Margaret, I need you to put that photograph back where you found it. Don't scan it. Don't share it with anyone." The urgency in her mother's voice made Margaret's skin prickle. "Why? What's wrong with it? Just do as I ask, please." But Margaret had never been good at following instructions when her curiosity was sparked. After the call ended, she examined the photograph more carefully, holding it up to the window light. The woman in the image wore a high-collared dress, typical of the era, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. The baby was almost completely obscured by the white cloth, only the top of its head visible. Something about the cloth bothered her. Margaret retrieved a magnifying glass from her grandfather's old desk and studied the fabric more closely. The embroidery was intricate, far more detailed than she'd initially noticed. Elaborate patterns of flowers and vines. But there was something else, something between the stitched designs that looked like stains, dark stains that had faded to brown with age. She spent the next hour examining every inch of the photograph, taking multiple high-resolution photos with her phone. When she zoomed in on the digital images, her breath caught. The stains weren't random. They formed patterns, shapes that looked almost deliberate. And at the edge of the cloth, barely visible, was what appeared to be a small handprint, far too small to belong to the infant in the picture. Margaret's hands trembled as she searched through the remaining boxes, looking for more photographs of Ellalinina Whitmore. She found 3 more images from the same period, all formal portraits, but none that showed the baby or the cloth. In one photograph, Ellalinina stood beside a tall man with a stern face and elaborate mustache, presumably her husband Thomas Whitmore. In another, she was surrounded by what looked like domestic staff in front of a large Victorian house. If you're enjoying this story so far, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps so much. But it was the third photograph that made Margaret's pulse quicken. It showed Ellalinina alone in what appeared to be a nursery. Behind her, clearly visible on a shelf, was a small wooden box with distinctive brass corners. Margaret had seen that box before. It was still in her grandmother's house, locked away in a cabinet in the study. Her grandmother had always been vague about its contents, saying only that it contained family documents that weren't to be disturbed. As darkness fell outside, Margaret made a decision. She photographed every page of the old family Bible she found in another box, particularly the entries recording births and deaths in the Whitmore family. What she discovered there only deepened the mystery. According to the Bible, Ella Lenina and Thomas Whitmore had 3 children. James, born 1900, Catherine, born 1902, and another entry that had been partially scratched out. The date reading 1903, the scratched-out entry sent chills down her spine. Someone had tried to erase this child from the family record, but the impression of the pen remained visible in the paper. Margaret could just make out a name. Sarah? She pulled out her laptop and began searching genealogy databases, census records, and newspaper archives from Boston in 1903. Hours passed as she fell deeper into the rabbit hole of historical research. She found records of Thomas Whitmore, a successful textile merchant. She found records of Ella Lenina, maiden name Eleanor Preston, daughter of a prominent Boston family. She found birth records for James and Catherine. But there was no birth record for Sarah, no death record either. It was as if the child had never existed, except for that one scratched-out entry in the family Bible and the haunting photograph of Ella Lenina holding an infant wrapped in white cloth. At midnight, exhausted but unable to stop, Margaret found a newspaper clipping from the Boston Herald dated September 1903. The headline read, "Whitmore family departs for Oregon Territory." The brief article mentioned Thomas Whitmore's decision to establish a new textile business in Portland, taking his wife and 2 children, only 2 children, with him. What had happened to Sarah? And why did the white cloth in the photograph bear those strange stains and that impossibly small handprint? Margaret stared at the image on her computer screen, the young mother's distant gaze now seeming less sad and more haunted, as if Ella Lenina Whitmore had been keeping a terrible secret even as she sat for that portrait in 1903. The attic suddenly felt colder, and Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that she'd stumbled onto something that had been deliberately hidden for more than a century. Something that might explain why her own mother had reacted with such alarm to the discovery of this particular photograph. Against her mother's wishes, Margaret drove to her grandmother's house the next morning. The Victorian mansion sat on a tree-lined street in Portland's noble neighborhood, its painted exterior showing signs of age, but still maintaining a dignified presence. Her grandmother, Patricia Chun, was 83 years old and sharp as ever, though she'd become increasingly reclusive since her husband's death 2 years earlier. "I knew you'd come," Patricia said when she opened the door, her voice resigned. She wore a cardigan despite the mild November temperature, and her silver hair was pulled back in a bun that reminded Margaret eerily of Ella Lenina's hairstyle in the photograph. "Grandma, I need to understand what happened. Who was Sarah?" Patricia's face tightened. "Your mother called me last night. She told me you found the photograph." She turned and walked slowly into the house, her cane tapping against the hardwood floor. "Come in. If you're going to insist on digging up the past, you might as well know the whole story, or at least the version that was passed down to me." They settled in the study, a room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large mahogany desk. Rain began to patter against the windows, and Patricia poured them both tea from a porcelain pot that had been in the family for generations. "Ella Lenina Whitmore was my grandmother," Patricia began. "I knew her when I was very young before she died in 1965. She was 90 years old, and her mind was mostly gone by then, but she had moments of clarity, terrible clarity." Patricia's hands shook slightly as she set down her teacup. She would sometimes grab my hand and whisper things, warnings, confessions. "I could never tell which," she'd say. "Don't let them find the cloth. Don't let them see what I did." "What did she do?" Patricia stood and walked to a locked cabinet. She withdrew a brass key from her pocket and opened it, revealing the wooden box Margaret had seen in the photograph. She placed it on the desk between them. "This box has been locked since Ella Lenina died. My mother gave me the key on her deathbed and told me never to open it. She said some secrets were meant to stay buried." Patricia's fingers traced the brass corners. "But you've already seen the photograph, so perhaps it's time." The key turned smoothly in the lock and the lid opened with a soft creak. Inside was a collection of letters, old newspaper clippings, and a small leather journal. But what caught Margaret's attention immediately was a piece of fabric, yellowed with age, embroidered with the same floral pattern she'd seen in the photograph. Margaret reached for it, but Patricia grabbed her wrist. "Don't touch it directly. Use these." She handed Margaret a pair of white cotton gloves. The cloth felt surprisingly heavy, and up close the stains were unmistakable. Margaret had worked briefly in a forensic lab during college. She recognized the distinctive pattern of old bloodstains. But there was something else about the fabric, something that made her skin crawl. The embroidery wasn't just decorative. When she looked closely, she realized the flowers and vines formed letters, words stitched so cleverly into the pattern that they were nearly invisible unless you knew to look for them. Leave a comment below about what you think of this story so far. "Help me," Margaret read aloud, tracing the hidden words with a gloved finger. "Please help me, Mother." "Why?" Patricia had gone pale. "I never saw that. In all these years, I never looked closely enough to see the words." Margaret's hands trembled as she continued examining the cloth. More words emerged from the pattern. Cold. So cold, Sarah, forgive. The stitching was exquisite, clearly done by a skilled hand. But the messages hidden within were desperate, heartbreaking. "Did Elena make this?" Margaret asked. "I don't know. Maybe she was an accomplished seamstress." Patricia opened the leather journal with obvious reluctance. This was Eleanor's diary. I've read portions of it over the years, though it made me sick to do so. The entries from 1903 tell a story that our family has tried to forget. Margaret leaned forward as Patricia read aloud in a shaking voice. July 15th, 1903, Thomas brought the doctor again. "He says I'm suffering from hysteria, that my grief has made me unwell, but I am not hysterical. I know what I saw. I know what happened. They think I have forgotten. But a mother never forgets. The cloth reminds me. I keep it close. Even though Thomas has forbidden it, he says we must move forward, that dwelling on tragedy will only bring more pain. But how can I move forward when I see her face every time I close my eyes?" Patricia's voice broke. She closed the journal. The entries become more disturbing. Eleanina writes about hearing crying at night, about finding small footprints in the nursery dust, about the cloth moving on its own. "My mother always said Eleanor had suffered a complete nervous breakdown after losing a child, that these were just the ravings of a grieving, unstable woman." "But Sarah was real," Margaret said. "The Bible entry proves she existed." "Real? Yes, but what happened to her?" That's where the story becomes unclear, contradictory, impossible. Patricia pulled out several newspaper clippings from the box. These are from Boston papers. August 1903, Margaret read the first headline. "Tragedy strikes prominent family, infant daughter lost." The article described how Sarah Whitmore, 3 months old, had disappeared from her nursery during a summer heat wave. The family had searched frantically. Police had investigated. Servants had been questioned, but no trace of the child was ever found. A second clipping dated a week later. "No progress in Whitmore case. Mother's testimony questioned." This article revealed that Eleanina had given confused and contradictory statements to police. Sometimes she claimed an intruder had taken Sarah. Other times she insisted Sarah had simply vanished, that she'd been there one moment and gone the next. The article noted that physicians had determined Mrs. Whitmore was suffering from severe nervous disorder and was no longer considered a reliable witness. A third clipping barely legible. "Whitmore family to leave Boston? Fresh start sought?" Thomas Whitmore had announced his intention to relocate the family to Oregon, stating that the tragedy had made remaining in Boston impossible. The article mentioned that Mrs. Whitmore's condition had not improved and that she remained deeply troubled by the loss. "They never found her body?" Margaret asked. "Never. It's as if Sarah Whitmore simply ceased to exist." Patricia retrieved another item from the box, a small tintype photograph even older than the one Margaret had found. It showed a baby, perhaps 2 months old, lying on an ornate cushion. The infant's eyes were open, staring directly at the camera with an unsettling intensity. "This is Sarah, taken a month before she disappeared. It's the only photograph we have of her besides the one of Eleanor holding her wrapped in the cloth." Margaret compared the two images on her phone. In the later photograph, the one showing Eleanor holding the wrapped infant, something was wrong with the proportions. The bundle in Eleanina's arms seemed too small, too flat, and Eleanina's hands weren't actually supporting the weight of a baby. They were positioned as if holding something much lighter. "Grandma," Margaret said slowly, "what if Sarah isn't in this photograph at all? What if Evelina is just holding the cloth? Patricia's face went gray. That thought has haunted me for years. I've wondered the same thing, and if that's true, then why? Why would Evelina pose with an empty cloth and pretend she was holding her child? They sat in silence, the rain intensifying outside. Finally, Margaret spoke. There has to be more. Evelina kept this cloth for over 60 years. She stitched those messages into it. She preserved these documents. She was trying to tell someone something, but she couldn't say it directly. Or she was simply mad with grief, Patricia said, but her voice held doubt. Margaret pulled out her phone and scrolled through the photographs she'd taken of the cloth, zooming in on different sections. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a corner of the fabric. "There's something else stitched here, separate from the other words. It's a date. August 14th, 1903. That's right before the family left Boston. Patricia, check the newspaper clippings. Sarah disappeared on August 12th. This date is 2 days later. And look at this," Margaret zoomed in further. Next to the date was a small embroidered image, a house with a specific number visible, 47. Below it, what appeared to be a street name worked into the vine pattern. "That's the address of the Whitmore house in," Patricia whispered. "It was torn down in the 1970s, but I've seen it in old family documents, 47 Beacon Street." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. Evelina had stitched a map, a guide, a message that had waited more than a century to be decoded. But what was she trying to tell them? What had happened at 47 Beacon Street on August 14th, 1903? The rain droomed harder against the windows, and in the dim light of the study, surrounded by Evelina Whitmore's carefully preserved secrets, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that they were only beginning to understand the terrible truth hidden in that photograph, and that the truth was far more disturbing than a simple tragedy. Margaret spent the next 2 weeks consumed by the mystery. She took a leave of absence from her job as a graphic designer and booked a flight to Boston. Patricia had been reluctant to support the trip, warning that some doors once opened can't be closed again, but she'd ultimately given Margaret copies of all the documents from Evelina's box. Boston in late November was cold and gray, the city wrapped in early winter gloom. Margaret had arranged to meet with Dr. Robert Harrison, a historian specializing in turn-of-the-century Boston, who worked at the Massachusetts Historical Society. She'd sent him digital copies of the photographs and documents, and his response had been immediate and intrigued. "The Whitmore case is actually documented in our archives," Dr. Harrison said when they met in his cluttered office. He was a man in his 60s with wild gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses. "It was quite a scandal at the time, though it's been largely forgotten. The disappearance of Sarah Whitmore generated significant press coverage, partly because the family was so prominent, but also because the circumstances were so bizarre." He pulled out a thick folder. "I've collected everything I could find from August 1903, police reports, witness statements, newspaper articles, even gossip column mentions. The story is fascinating and deeply disturbing." Margaret leaned forward as Dr. Harrison spread documents across his desk. The official investigation concluded that Sarah Whitmore had been abducted, most likely by someone with access to the household, but several elements never added up. First, the nursery window was locked from the inside. Second, none of the servants heard or saw anything unusual, despite several of them sleeping on the same floor. Third, Evelina's own testimony was contradictory to the point of being unusable. The newspapers said she was unreliable because of nervous disorder. Margaret said the newspapers were being polite. If you read the actual police reports, it's clear that Evelina's statements were more than just confused. They were impossible. Dr. Harrison pulled out a yellow document. "This is Detective William Porter's interview notes. According to this, Evelina initially told police that she'd put Sarah to bed at 8 o'clock wrapped in a white embroidered cloth that had belonged to her own mother. She checked on the baby at 10 o'clock and Sarah was fine. But when she went to the nursery at midnight, the baby was gone. Only the cloth remained lying on the mattress." "That doesn't sound impossible. Wait for it." Dr. Harrison flipped to another page. When Porter questioned her the next day, Evelina changed her story. She said Sarah had never gone to bed that night. She claimed she'd been holding the baby wrapped in the cloth when Thomas came to tell her something. She looked down and the cloth was empty. Sarah was simply gone, vanished from her arms. If this story is keeping you hooked, hit that like button and subscribe. It really helps. Margaret felt cold. That's what I suspected when I looked at the photograph. The proportions are wrong. She's not actually holding a baby. There's more. Dr. Harrison pulled out another document. 3 days after the disappearance, police searched the Whitmore house again. They found something disturbing in the basement. A small room that Thomas Whitmore claimed was just storage space. But according to this report, the room had been recently modified. There was fresh mortar in the walls, new bricks that didn't match the rest of the foundation. Did they break through the walls? Thomas refused to allow it. He had powerful connections, lawyers who argued that the police had no probable cause. The investigation stalled. And then suddenly Thomas announced the family was moving to Oregon. Within 2 weeks they were gone. The house was sold, the investigation closed as an unsolved abduction, and Sarah Whitmore became just another tragic statistic. Margaret pulled out her phone and showed Dr. Harrison the enhanced images of the cloth. Ella Lenina stitched messages into the embroidery, and she marked the house address and a specific date, August 14th, 2 days after Sarah disappeared. Dr. Harrison's eyes widened behind his glasses. That's extraordinary. She was leaving evidence, but in a way that would seem like just decoration to anyone who didn't know to look for it. Can we find out what happened at that address on August 14th? We can try. Dr. Harrison led Margaret to the Society's archives, a vast room filled with filing cabinets and old newspapers. They spent hours searching through documents, census records, and city directories. Finally, Dr. Harrison made a small noise of discovery. Here, Fire Department records for August 14, 1903. There was a small fire at 47 Beacon Street that evening. The fire brigade responded at approximately 9 o'clock. The fire was contained to the basement area. Minimal damage. The report notes that Thomas Whitmore was burning documents and some items got out of control, burning documents 2 days after his daughter disappeared. The fire marshal noted it in his report but took no action. Whitmore claimed he was simply disposing of old business papers. But look at this. The marshal made a personal notation at the bottom of the report. Dr. Harrison squinted at the faded handwriting. He writes, "Peculation, not wood smoke." Mr. Whitmore, agitated, refused thorough inspection. Recommended follow-up, but there's no record of any follow-up. Margaret felt sick. What kind of smell? He doesn't specify, but fire marshals in that era were experienced enough to distinguish between different types of burning materials. Dr. Harrison's voice was quiet. They would have known if something other than paper was burning. They continued searching through records, finding small pieces of the puzzle. A servant dismissed from the Whitmore household a week after Sarah's disappearance had told reporters that Ella Lenina had become obsessed with the cloth, that she carried it everywhere, refusing to wash it despite the stains. Another servant mentioned hearing Ella Lenina talking to the empty cloth at night as if the baby was still wrapped in it. A physician's report noted that Ella Lenina showed signs of severe melancholia and possible delusions, but also mentioned something strange. Mrs. Whitmore insists she can feel weight in her arms when holding the cloth, though it is clearly empty. She reports the fabric feels warm. Most concerning is her claim that the cloth remembers her daughter. Grief can cause psychological breaks, Dr. Harrison said. People experiencing profound loss sometimes develop tactile hallucinations. But the consistency of Ella Lenina's testimony, the way she maintained the same core story despite contradictory details, it suggests she genuinely believed what she was saying. Margaret looked at the photograph on her phone again, studying Ella Lenina's face. What if she wasn't delusional? What if something really did happen that couldn't be explained logically? You're asking if I believe in the supernatural, Dr. Harrison said carefully. I'm a historian. I deal in documented facts, but I'll say this. I've studied this case for 20 years, and there's something profoundly wrong about it. The physical evidence doesn't add up, the timeline doesn't work, and the Whitmore family's behavior afterwards. The way they fled Boston, the way they tried to erase Sarah from their family history, suggests they were hiding something that terrified them. As evening fell and they prepared to leave the archives, Dr. Harrison pulled out one final document. I almost forgot. Last year there was a development. The house at 47 Beacon Street, or rather the building that replaced it in the 1970s, underwent renovation. The construction crew found something in the walls of what would have been the original basement. The city sent the items to us for archival evaluation. He led Margaret to a storage room and retrieved a small box. Inside was a collection of items. Old buttons, fragments of fabric, pieces of children's toys. But at the bottom was something that made Margaret's breath stop. A small leather baby shoe barely 3 in long, darkened with age, and something that looked horribly like dried blood. "The shoe is from the early 1900s, Dr. Harrison said. The construction crew found it sealed in a wall cavity along with these other items. We have no way to prove it belonged to Sarah Whitmore, but the timing and location are suggestive." Margaret reached for the shoe with trembling hands, then stopped. "The cloth in the photograph. Can you see what's embroidered on it?" Dr. Harrison looked at the enhanced image on Margaret's phone, zooming in on a corner of the fabric. His face went pale. "It's a shoe. She stitched a tiny shoe into the pattern." They stared at each other across the storage room, the implications hanging heavy in the air. Eleanor had known. Whatever had happened to Sarah, Eleanor had known where evidence could be found. She'd left clues. Hidden messages, a trail that would take more than a century to decode. But the truth itself remained just out of reach, like Ella Lenina's distant gaze in the photograph, looking at something beyond what the camera could capture, beyond what the living were meant to see. Margaret returned to Portland with copies of everything Dr. Harrison had found. She spread the documents across her apartment floor, trying to piece together a coherent narrative from fragments of evidence and whispered family secrets. The leather baby shoe sat on her desk, a silent witness to something terrible that had happened more than a century ago. The night after her return, she visited Patricia again. Her grandmother looked older, more fragile, as if the weight of family history was finally crushing her. They sat in the study where they'd first opened Eleanor's box, and Margaret showed her everything she'd discovered. "So, we know that something happened in the basement on August 14th, Margaret said. "Thomas burned documents, possibly other things. He made modifications to the walls. Sarah's shoe was found sealed in those walls. Ella Lenina left clues pointing to that exact location and date." Patricia's hands shook as she held the photograph of Eleanor in the cloth. "My mother once told me something when I was very young. She said Eleanor had confessed to her on her deathbed, but my mother never told me what that confession was. She said some knowledge was too heavy to pass on, that it would poison whoever carried it. But we already know Ella Lenina was there when Sarah disappeared. The question is what actually happened." "No," Patricia said softly. "The question is whether we want to know, whether we need to know. Ella Lenina spent 60 years keeping that cloth, stitching her messages, preserving her secrets, but she never told anyone directly. She never went to the police with whatever truth she was hiding. Maybe that means the truth is something that shouldn't be spoken aloud." Margaret felt frustration rising. "We can't just stop here. Sarah was a real child. She existed and then she was gone. Don't we owe it to her to find out what happened?" "Do we?" Patricia's voice was sharp. "Sarah is gone. Eleanor is gone. Thomas is gone. Everyone who lived through whatever happened that August has been dead for decades. What good does exposing this do now except to stain our family name and open wounds that have finally started to heal?" "You sound like you know something you're not telling me." Patricia was silent for a long moment. Rain began again outside, a constant presence in Portland's autumn. Finally, she spoke. "After you left for Boston, I did something I'd sworn I would never do. I read all of Eleanor's diary, not just the excerpts. The entries from August 1903 are disturbing, increasingly incoherent. But there's one entry from August 15th, the day after the fire, that was relatively clear." She retrieved the diary from the locked cabinet and opened it to a marked page. "This is what Ella Lenina wrote. What I have done cannot be undone. What Thomas has done to cover my sin cannot be revealed. The cloth holds all that remains. Sarah is in the walls and in the fabric and in my arms where no one else can feel her. The doctor says I am mad. Perhaps I am. But a mother knows her child, alive or dead, present or absent. The weight of her is still with me. It will always be with me. I deserve no less. That's it." The rest of the diary is either blank pages or increasingly incomprehensible entries about the cloth moving, about hearing crying, about Sarah calling for her. Elenina never wrote explicitly what happened to her daughter. Margaret read the entry again, trying to pass meaning from Elenina's cryptic words. My sin, she's saying she did something or she believes she did. Postpartum depression was poorly understood in 1903. Women suffering from it were often diagnosed with hysteria or madness. Eleanor may have had a psychotic break, may have harmed her child while not in her right mind, and Thomas, whether out of love or fear of scandal, covered it up. The basement, the fresh mortar, the sealed walls. Yes, but that doesn't explain everything, Margaret said. It doesn't explain the messages stitched into the cloth decades later. It doesn't explain Eleanor's consistent claim that Sarah vanished from her arms. It doesn't explain why she could feel weight in the empty cloth. Grief and guilt can create powerful delusions, or Margaret said slowly. Something else happened. Something that couldn't be explained rationally. So, Thomas and Elenina conspired to hide it, to bury it literally and figuratively. Something that terrified them so much that they ran across the country to escape it. Patricia closed the diary. You want there to be a mystery. You want this to be something supernatural, inexplicable, because that's more interesting than the sad reality of a mother who harmed her child during a moment of illness and a family that covered up the crime. Don't you wonder, though? Don't you look at that photograph and see something wrong? Something that can't quite be explained by madness or crime. I've wondered my entire life, Patricia admitted. I've looked at that photograph 1,000 times. I've held that cloth. And yes, there's something about it that feels wrong, that makes my skin crawl. But feelings aren't evidence. Horror stories aren't history. They sat in silence, the weight of unanswered questions filling the room. Finally, Margaret asked, what happened to Eleanor in Oregon? How did she live with whatever she'd done or witnessed? She survived. That's about all you can say. She had 2 more children with Thomas, though by all accounts, the marriage was cold, distant. She never spoke of Sarah. When my mother was born, Elenina wouldn't hold her for the first 3 months. She said she couldn't bear the weight of another infant in her arms. She kept the cloth hidden away, only taking it out in private. And according to my mother, Elenina would sometimes wrap the cloth around her arms and rock back and forth, singing lullabies to something no one else could see. That's heartbreaking. It's many things. Heartbreaking, disturbing, perhaps evidence of ongoing mental illness. But here's what has always bothered me most. Patricia pulled out one final document from Elenina's box, a letter written in shaky handwriting. This is from 1963, 2 years before Elenina died. She wrote it to my mother, but never sent it. I found it among her belongings after she passed. The letter read, Dearest Anne, I am 98 years old now, and my time is short. I have carried a burden for 60 years that I cannot put down, even in death. You deserve to know the truth, though I fear the knowing will hurt you. Sarah did not die. She was not taken. She simply left. I cannot explain it better than that. One moment she was in my arms, warm and alive, and the next there was only the cloth. Thomas thought I had done something terrible, that I had hidden her away, or worse, he tore apart the house looking for her. He found nothing because there was nothing to find. She was simply gone. Thomas made his choice. He buried the truth in the walls, literal and figurative. He told the world our daughter had been abducted, and we fled before anyone could discover his deception. He spent the rest of his life believing I was either a murderer or insane. And I let him believe it because the truth was impossible. But I knew I felt her leave. I feel her still in the cloth and the weight that never leaves my arms. She is everywhere and nowhere, present and absent, real and impossible. I should have spoken sooner. I should have told someone. But who would have believed me? And what good would it have done? Sarah is beyond reach, beyond explanation, beyond help. The cloth remembers. That is all I can say with certainty. The cloth remembers my daughter. And because of that, I remember too. Forgive me for burdening you with this. Forgive me for all my failures, Mother. Margaret's eyes were wet as she finished reading. She's saying Sarah just vanished. Literally ceased to exist. Or she's saying that's what she believed happened because her mind couldn't accept whatever she'd actually done. The letter doesn't resolve anything. It just adds another layer of mystery to a story that's already incomprehensible. What do you believe, Grandma? Really? Patricia looked at the photograph of Ella Lenina, at the distant gaze, at the cloth that might or might not hold an infant, at the stains that might be blood or might be something else entirely. I believe something terrible happened in August 1903. I believe Ella Lenina and Thomas tried to bury it. I believe Ella Lenina carried that burden until the day she died. Beyond that, she shook her head. I don't know if we're meant to understand. Some mysteries exist in the space between what happened and what we can comprehend. Margaret spent the next few weeks trying to find more answers. She hired a genealogist to trace the Whitmore family line. She contacted descendants of the servants who had worked in the Boston house. She even spoke with a forensic anthropologist about the possibility of examining the baby shoe for DNA evidence. But each avenue led nowhere. The genealogist confirmed that Sarah Whitmore had vanished from all records after August 12, 1903. The servant descendants knew only vague family stories about a tragedy. The forensic anthropologist said the shoe was too degraded for reliable DNA testing, and even if they could extract DNA, there was nothing to compare it to. No confirmed samples from Sarah or Eleanor existed. The story remained frustratingly incomplete, hovering in the liminal space between tragedy and mystery, between documented history and family legend. Margaret created a detailed timeline, collected every piece of evidence, interviewed everyone she could find with any connection to the Whitmore family. She even visited the site where 47 Beacon Street had stood, now occupied by a modern office building, and felt nothing but the cold wind of a Boston winter. In the end, she was left with the same items Patricia had guarded for decades. A photograph of a woman holding something that might be a child or might be an empty cloth. A piece of embroidered fabric with hidden messages stitched by someone who may have been confessing or accusing or simply trying to remember. And a leather baby shoe that proved only that a child had once existed, not what had become of her. The photograph still sits in Patricia's house, locked away in Ella Lenina's box. Sometimes Margaret visits and takes it out, studying Ella Lenina's face, looking for answers in that distant gaze. The cloth remains folded beneath it. The embroidered messages waiting to be decoded by someone who might understand them better than Margaret could. But the truth, the real truth of what happened to Sarah Whitmore, remains sealed in the walls of a demolished house, or buried in the mind of a woman who died 60 years ago, or hidden in the weight of an empty cloth that a grieving mother insisted still held her daughter. Some mysteries solve themselves over time as new evidence emerges or new technologies reveal old secrets, but others persist, growing more opaque with each passing year, until the line between history and legend becomes so blurred that no one can say with certainty where one ends and the other begins. Ella Lenina Whitmore took her secrets to the grave, leaving behind only fragments, clues, and questions. And perhaps that was her intention all along, to create a story that could never be fully told, a truth that would remain forever, just beyond reach. Like the child she claimed had vanished from her arms into a space that logic and reason couldn't touch, the photograph remains what it has always been, a moment frozen in time, a mother and child preserved in silver and light, a family secret that refuses to be fully revealed. And in Ella Lenina's distant gaze, looking past the camera into some unknowable distance, there might be sadness or guilt or terror or grief or perhaps all of these things at once, layered together into an expression that transcends any single emotion and becomes simply the face of someone who witnessed something the rest of us can never see. If you enjoyed this story, leave a comment below. I love hearing your thoughts and answering questions. If you're not subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video.